really the way it happened. I've told the story the way I perceive. If you read between the lines of some of these ancient Jewish texts, it's more like it's a debate that's going on within Judaism itself. How Greek should we be? How much do you accommodate the dominant culture? Precisely the way you get a lot of this kind of debate in the modern world, our time, of how much do you want your kids, your Jewish boys and girls, to assimilate to be just as American as everybody else? How much intermarriage do you want to have or do you allow? If you're a Muslim immigrant to this country, the first generation, do you let them listen to hip-hop? Do you let the women stop covering their hair? Where do you draw the line? What I'm arguing is that this was what was going on, and it was an internal Jewish conflict that was going on. There were several responses to Hellenization, therefore, among Jews. It wasn't just that that Greeks are here putting this onto Jews. There were responses within Judaism itself. As I've already said, Menelaus and the liberals accept it and promote it. Another priest that had been dislocated from the high priesthood earlier, his family had originally been the high priesthood family, Onias. I think Onias IV is on your handout there. Onias IV actually withdrew from Jerusalem and went off and built a new temple. So he says, well, if you're going to destroy the existing Jewish temple, we're going to have an alternative temple elsewhere. You also have these people that come to be called the Hasidim. It's on your handout. That's from a Hebrew word meaning the holy ones or pious ones or something like that. And they're not to be confused with the modern Hasidim who live in Brooklyn and who come from Eastern Europe. That's a modern movement that came about in the medieval period and has come through. But it's the same word used for these people. These were Jews who decided to be very strict, and they seemed to reject a lot of Greek culture. They certainly rejected Greek religion and Greek sacrifice. They seemed to have promoted the speaking of Hebrew, the use of Hebrew texts, and particularly pious observations of Jewish law. You even have a group of high priests, former high priests, who have been dislocated, and other priestly families withdrawing from Jerusalem and apparently going out in the desert and maybe building a community out there. And we find out about them in the 20th century when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the late 1940s. And so a lot of the theories are these Dead Sea Scrolls were the writings of a sect of Jews led by people who had been priestly families, who moved out into the desert, set up camp on the shores of the Dead Sea, and had their own little sort of maybe quasi-monastic community there, very strict in their observation of the law. They keep their documents. They have some documents in Greek, some in Hebrew, some in Aramaic. So that may have been another way to respond to this increasing Hellenization, is just to pull away and form a different community. And then you have the reaction of Mattathias. Mattathias was a priest from Jerusalem who had settled in a village called Modin in the hill country of Judea. And apparently, according to the texts that come down to us, some of which have to be sort of legends and that sort of thing, hero worship, but the story goes that Mattathias was in his village, and a priest and a soldier come from Jerusalem to the village, and they're trying to force the Jews to sacrifice on an altar. Now, what an altar is most of the time is, do y'all see this little base over there in the corner? There's just a little pillar that might be this high, and to offer something, you don't actually have to sacrifice a chicken or anything like that. You can obviously sacrifice animals, but you can just pour out some wine, or you can pour some grain or something like that on the altar and burn it up, and that will suffice as an offering to a god without killing an animal. Something like this may have been going on. Mattathias, it is said, took the sword away from the soldier and killed this priest and the soldier for encouraging Jews in his village to sacrifice to the gods. This, of course, was against the law. So Mattathias runs off to the hills, taking his family with him, his sons. He had several sons, and this is the beginning of the war that comes to be called the Maccabean Revolt. It's called Maccabean because after Mattathias died, shortly thereafter, he was the leader of the revolt in the beginning, his son Judas becomes the head general of the bunch. And Judas early on earned the nickname Maccabeus. And we're not really sure what the nickname means or where it comes from. It could be something like the hammer. So, you know, he could be Judah the hammer. But it may have been an attribute from him being a very good general and winning a lot of battles. But against all odds, this ragtag bunch of basically guerrilla fighters up against a far superior army of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, they beat them. They retook Jerusalem. They didn't actually beat them in Syria. They just beat them several battles in Judah. And Judas was able to recapture Jerusalem and the temple. And in the year 164, they cleansed the temple of the profanation, the pollution of having maybe pigs and things like that sacrificed, being polluted as a Greek temple. And so 164 is the beginning of the celebration of the Jewish holiday, Hanukkah. The Hanukkah song now? No, we won't sing the Hanukkah song. So 164, in the cleansing of the temple, is what Jews celebrate with Hanukkah. Judas Maccabeus reigned as not an official king at that point, but he reigned over Judea this time. And there were still battles that raged between him and his family and his army and Antiochus IV Epiphanes and then other descendants. After he died, his brother, one of his brothers became the leader, and then another brother became the leader. Gradually, these different people of this family came to set up their own dynasty of rulers themselves. Their family name was not Maccabeus, that was just a nickname. The family name was Hasmoneus, and so we call this the Hasmonean dynasty. That's the descendants of Mattathias. Some of them actually were then proclaimed king. They were recognized as with the title king by the later rulers of the neighboring areas like the Greco-Syrian Empire. So the Hasmonean dynasty was in power from the year 165 to the year 60 BCE. Now, that's the way one people responded to this, as they revolted against the rulers. But another way some Jews responded was by believing that military revolt wasn't the way to go, that God would somehow intervene miraculously, that God would send an angel or some kind of heavenly figure down to earth, and an army of heavenly figures would defeat Antiochus and usher in the new kingdom of Israel. And that's where you get the story of that from the book of Daniel. So I asked you to read Daniel, at least the last part of Daniel for today. If you've got your Bibles, take it out and turn with me first to Daniel chapter 8, verse 20. Now, the book of Daniel is in two halves. The first half of it tells about the adventures of this young man Daniel, who's very, very wise and very smart and very loyal, and who refuses to worship the Persian god. And of course, these are morality stories written for Jews who are living under Greek domination, encouraging them not to worship Greek gods. But it's cast in the distant past. Then the second half of Daniel is a whole series of visions and prophecies. And Daniel says, I was in a dream, I was in a vision on the day, and I saw this, and this angel told me to this, and this person told me this. And so it's a narration of the history of humankind, that's part of which has already happened by Daniel, but most of which is to happen in the future for Daniel. And some of this stuff actually does happen. So for example, and he tells about different beasts. There's the ram that does this. There's the beast that does this. But you know that these beasts represent different kingdoms. Because in chapter 8, verse 20, he says, as for the ram that you saw in your vision, with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, there was the kingdom of the Medes and the kingdom of the Persians who came together under Cyrus. The male goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between its eyes is the first king. So that would be Philip, Alexander's father. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. So this is Alexander. He's broken. And his kingdom is divided up into 4 empires, like I told you about earlier. But none of those 4 empires enjoys the same power that Alexander the Great enjoyed with his. So now, notice how you're already given a clue right here in Daniel that these different images, these different beasts, are to refer to kingdoms that are going to come in the future from Daniel's perspective. We know actually that they already did. Then what happens in Daniel is each different chapter, the last part of Daniel, in a sense tells the story over again. He has another vision. And instead of reading it chronologically, as if chapter 9 told about one century, and then chapter 10 or chapter 11 is the next century and the next century, you actually have to read them like cycles, because what Daniel's doing is he's giving you a prophecy of what's going to happen politically related to Judea, but he's giving it to you in several different visions that all tell the same story, just in different kind of symbols. So turn over now to chapter 11. Here again, it's sort of like the fourth, chapter 11, verse 2. The fourth shall be far richer than all of them. When he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. So this is actually talking about the Persian ruler who will attack Greece. Then a warrior king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion. That's Alexander. While still rising in power, Alexander, remember, was still young and increasing his power when he died. His kingdom shall be broken and divided to the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity. Alexander had a child, but the child dies, and Alexander's kingdom did not go to any of his own offspring. It went to these other four generals. Then notice in verse 5, then the king of the south shall grow strong. And the next verse, the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to ratify the agreement. Okay, what's the king of the south? Who's the king of the south? Ptolemy. Some Ptolemy. One of the Ptolemies. So whenever you see king of the south in Daniel, it's always referring to the Ptolemaic dynasty, one of the Ptolemies. Who's the king of the north? Seleucus or Antiochus. So whenever you see the king of the north, it refers to one of the Seleucids. So over and over again in Daniel, you're going to get the king of the north, the king of the south, the king of the north. And notice how it says, the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to ratify the agreement. And if you look down, if you have a study Bible and you look at your footnotes, it'll actually give you the names of these different people that historians can identify. So say, oh, this may be Berenice because we know that she was a daughter of Antiochus or Seleucus. She was married to one of these Ptolemies. If you follow in your study Bible, and it has to be a good critical study Bible. I mean, if you, by real scholars, if you use, these Bibles that take all this as prophecy that relates to the Soviet Union or to Russia, they might tell you things like, well, the king of the north here refers to, the head of the Politburo or something like this. And so if it's a Bible by a contemporary church that takes all this as referring to our time or the time immediately to the future, which of course a lot of Christians do, then their footnotes might be different. But the footnotes in any good study Bible will place these people to the history of what's going on in Judea at this time. Now go over to chapter 11, verse 29. Because I'm not going to lead you through all the stuff that happens in chapter 11, because if you read it and you read it with the footnotes, it's basically telling you a history of the battles and alliances between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and where Judea was caught in the middle at different times. At the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south. This is this is Antiochus, not Antiochus IV, but different. But this time it shall not be as before, for ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall lose heart and withdraw. Who are the Kittim? Romans, exactly. The Kittim is a term that's used in Hebrew in a lot of different ancient Jewish texts, and sometimes it seems to refer to the Greeks. And here it clearly refers to the Romans, because the Romans come and they force the king of the north back. Notice what it says. Forces sent by him, he shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the holy covenant. Antiochus IV will pay attention to the Jews who've forsaken the Torah. Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and the fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. Or in some modern English translations, like the abomination of desolation. That term will be used also in the New Testament in several places. He shall seduce with intrigue those who violate the covenant. That is, the bad Jews who violated the Torah. He will be in cahoots with Antiochus. But the people who are loyal to their God shall stand firm and take action. The wise among the people shall give understanding to many, and for some days, however, they shall fall by sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. Who are the wise? The author of the book. Remember, he spent the whole first part of the book setting up Daniel as a wise man. So this author, writing in the name of Daniel, a wise man, identifies other wise Jews of his own day. And he says they're going to oppose Antiochus IV, and some of them will die because of it. When they fall victim, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join them insincerely. Some scholars believe that this little help may be this author's reference to Judas Maccabeus.